So you should probably play the game once in a while so you don't lose your warm-up. Oh, I did already, which is good. So today I shrunken the process. We warmed up all the way to 185. We shrunk down how long it took. And then we got down to we didn't get down as far as I want. But we got down to here. But that's pretty close. My session was already over. Right? I had like one more, 140, 130, and maybe 120. This is the only 120 we have. So we simplified the up and down curves, so that's why I stopped voluntarily. And again, thanks for your concern. Obviously, I always try, like, if someone shares something, you bet I'm going 300%, whether they are here listening or not, or you know, maybe I touch their, like, challenge their pride or something. I'm not gonna stop trying to be as enthusiastic as possible. If individuals don't stay around for that, that's perfectly fine. I just wish them the best and be happy with it, right? It's pretty clear that as I present a question, I'm gonna throw this out there. I'm sure the people who are around that's always listening to me drone on and on, I always end with a question. So, or I try to always end with a question, right? The moment that question is not responded after my long digression, I know where I stand. So that's kind of the idea. So you will probably hear me say something to the person, like to whoever it is, leave with a sentiment, and I have to make sure that the conversation actually ended voluntarily. If not, then I would make the assertion that they have already left and they're off to, like, the real deal is that they're off to, like, soak in whatever is more important to them. That's pretty much what you have to accept. So when you talk to individuals that are incredibly expressive about their own personality and principles, and I commonly will challenge them to be resonating and compassionate, then that's the rodeo that I typically, and that's the cycle that happens all the time. And I'm willing to say it's worth it. It's always worth it to in my opinion. It's obviously naive. I want to also ask if you always had a focus on learning as much as possible, or did it just happen at some point of life? That's a fun question. So, have I always had a focus on learning as much as possible, or did it just happen at some point of my life? You're probably gonna guess what my response is. It's both. And here's the both. The long story short, like the hot take is it's both and more. A slightly longer take is that when I'm a kid, right, I had some strengths. It was only until adulthood that I could reflect upon what I did well as a kid to understand it was the same thing all along. And even in post-adulthood, like my career, it still required refinement. And then as I grow older, it became clearer and clearer what the focus was. So in a way, no, it just did just happen at some point at life. It probably happened in school, when I went to school as a kid, like 5 years old, or maybe even younger. My earliest memory about learning is when I was 5 years old, learning the multiplication tables at home. So it just happened some point at my life without my awareness. And then that focus, which is technically, yes, it probably happened later in life because I actually choose to focus on learning as much as possible consciously. Probably sometime after high school. After high school, the chains were let loose, right? You are less bound by your fundamentals anymore. And the moment you accomplish your fundamentals, you use that as a basis to learn by leaps and bounds. So that was the idea. Let's pick this one. Yeah, so both. I think as a kid, I have always learned as much as possible. But I didn't know how much it hurt me. You might be thinking, wait, how does wanting to learn as much as possible hurt you? As a kid, I told this story a bunch of times, and it makes a lot more... I connected the dots way after, like when I was in adulthood. I was very miserable when I was younger. Like, I was incredibly miserable. And one of the things was because I wasn't learning as much. There wasn't enough things to learn at the pace that I needed to learn them at. Outside of the whole, like, bullying and all that stuff, like, if you shelve the stressors of life, like getting up in the morning, going on the bus stop, and then meeting people who don't really like you because of the way you look, all that stuff. If you shelve that stuff, going to school was fantastic. With one really big caveat. There just wasn't enough things to learn. So when there isn't enough things to learn, it gets boring. And when it gets boring, what is a kid to do? Well, they cope in silence. And maybe potentially become nihilistic. So sometimes later in life, I thought maybe it's just the bullying, right? Like the being in a culture that I'm not used to because my family's culture is different from the culture around me. It's that too, for sure. It's definitely that too. However, it's compounded by the idea that I just don't learn at the same pace as my surrounding peers. By the way, when I got to graduate school, that was not the case. My peers, it's a, as you get closer to specialized skills, you get closer and closer in gap between my peers. And I am surrounded by brilliant people, even in college. Like, my best friends are incredibly high functioning people. So after college, right, then it became really noticeable about the learning process and whatnot, and how much it could have exacerbated things. The story continues though. The reason why I know this upon reflection is there's a period in time when I was young, I was identified as a gifted person. And that gift by luck, it's just sheer luck. I don't necessarily think, it was by coincidence, I guess, because I was like a transfer student and I looked different. I guess I might have projected some sort of emotions differently, and somehow I got identified, right? So the reason why that created very salient is because I became happier and more content to go to school immediately after being able to participate in that program. As in, that program did things that are incredibly much more dynamic outside of just memorizing things and foundational knowledge, right? Because the learning process is the same. It's standardized because it takes a very long time on average for someone to create the foundations of learning, because they're not really engaged, like in an emotional way. Like, kids tend to learn faster if you can gain their emotional engagement. And generally, the one-size-fits-all in formal education, it's a hit or miss. It's an averaging effect. It's a very mid-averaging effect, right? And for me, it wasn't. And what happens is that it feels like I'm doing the same thing. The only thing that changed was its context. Like, all right, well, if I'm going to learn English, it's a very similar approach to the way I learned math, which is the very same approach in science. That standardization in early education is to help overcome the time efficiency, the mere exposure that's needed to condition the large majority of students to normalize that type of learning. Well, in the gifted program, like in the gifted time, we have like an hour. I think it was like 45 minutes. All we did during those times is to learn differently. That's it. Like, they just gave us different tasks that we had to do to solve problems differently. So then when I couldn't just memorize things and then, regurgitate it and then solve the problem that way, I had to learn new skills, new learning skills. How do you construct something when you don't have the knowledge of doing so? And that's when critical thinking, problem solving feed into the learning process. And that was the most remarkable thing I've ever taken away from high school. It was kind of like a mix of middle school and high school. And then when you go off to college, that's basically it. That's history. The moment you get into upper education, I went to a liberal arts college and then a liberal arts university for graduate school. And one of the things that is characteristic of this phrase liberal arts is the idea that you're challenged to think differently, or think as comprehensively as you can, as flexibly as you can, interdisciplinary as possible, not necessarily iterative. So yes, there are tools that you need to understand foundations and iteration. However, the idea is you are going to come up with very challenging questions and problems you have to solve, and the things you've learned might need to adapt to it. And that engaged me for a lot. Actually, one last story where this ends is that it engaged me so much, it consumed my life. So the other day when you were talking about burnout, I burned out. The end of the story, like the big end of the story, is I burned so hard that it only took like 7 years before I burned out. I loved everything about it. However, I couldn't physically keep up with it. It was so demanding that I stopped eating. I stopped talking to other people. It just consumed my life. Like talking to other people in a self-management way. So like I stopped talking to friends. And stuff, like socializing outside of the task of learning and doing things. So it became non-sustainable. So I know for sure that this is something that I enjoy a lot. It gives me the most dopamine. However, I have to build a life around regulating it, because you can totally burn out. Obviously, that's what dopamine addiction is, right? Only I'm not addicted to, like, I don't know, clicking circles. I'm addicted to the idea of people clicking circles and how they learn to click circles, as opposed to me saying, oh yeah, it's really novel, that you're making this type of music. Tell me how you came about making this music. How did you learn to appreciate this music? And that's endless. In my opinion, it's endless. If it's the same and it meets my predictions, the next one can be different. It's constantly different. It's often not consistent enough to think that, oh, the next one's gonna be exactly the same. Unless you're a cynic. I can understand when people become cynical. about these things. And it's like, oh yeah, you're just another person who is, which I feel like I might have accidentally given that impression. But generally speaking, that dialogue we had, just to tie it back to where all this digression occurred, the dialogue about classical guitarists, it is so pre-selecting. So when you pre-select a choice, a career choice, as opposed to grounding it, balancing it out with objectivity and realism, generally it's incredibly, in my opinion, it's beautifully naive. It's endearingly naive. At the same time, it doesn't stop them from becoming great people. My discussion about it is usually presuming that that person would like to hear something different that may help ground their expectations. And if they reject it, then we don't talk anymore. That's fair enough. It's anyone's prerogative to walk away from it. I will generally not walk away from it, because my whole entire goal is to get the story from the person. So it's not a fair comparison. It's a one-way exchange. And you would have to keep cynicism at bay to really know how it feels to burn out about that. I burn out about that because it's just, I don't stop. The people that I talk to stop me. And I hope that's the case most of the time. If I ever meet my adversary and they would like go toe to toe, I think both of us would probably lack sleep, drain each other, and we would be in like a very vicious positive feedback forward loop that requires a third party to help regulate. I haven't met a person that rivaled me. Just not that that person doesn't exist. It's that the things I choose to do doesn't enrich for bumping into someone like that. Like the platform I choose, the things I do, rarely those people are concerned with using their skills to do this type of thing, in my opinion. If most of it happened before university, do you think you could have chosen any subject in university and be equally successful in PhD? That's a fun thought experiment, huh? We'll start with a popular logic. We'll start with the logical one. So, if I really love learning, right, in such an early age, is there something natural, like naturally objective about learning that when you take into the structures that already exist, like the social structure, like the learning social structure, like what is science supposed to be? And again, this goes back, I'm gonna relate this back. It goes to contemporary viewpoints. If the contemporary viewpoints is that people who learn very well caters to the sciences, then I would probably say no. I wouldn't have chosen just any subject, but I would have probably been very coincidentally likely to choose the same path, right? That's one perspective. That's one little like logic perspective, right? If learning process is inherently logical, or it necessitates a form, an aptitude for logic in order to like get the best of the learning process or excel, and I live in a society that have certain career outlooks that emphasizes that particular property, if we accept this to be true, then the answer would be no. I wouldn't be equally as successful in other fields, right? Let's accept that for a moment. Now, if we were to accept that the learning process can vindicate any type of glass ceiling I have, So for example, not even just PhD, let's go further, right? Not even PhD, let's go to like sports and human resources, like communication, speech, and things like that. If learning unlocks that potential, I would say then we have to think about it subjectively. So not appealing to logic. Let's define it more in the sense that what does it mean to be equally successful? Well, a lot of times to someone who has a PhD, at least in my opinion, is to be able to, if the problem is to be successful, like the task is to be successful, one just simply have to convince oneself to be successful, right? Because philosophy is part of the doctorate. So I would argue that if you were to ask me, and I'm someone who chose, I don't know, the path of psychology or something, the answer would probably be resounding yes, regardless of what it is. Because if the learning process is necessary to appreciate, just like be able to be content and appreciate the full extent of a discipline, then if any form of my parallel universes who like choose their topic, they would probably equally say they were successful or feel successful, and they would probably all disclaim that successful is subjective, which is a big take too. That's when appealing to the subjectivity thing, right? That is to counterbalance the whole contemporary thing, like objectivity and finding other people to agree with logic. The opinion that I just said is the people who trailblaze, like, oh, it doesn't matter what I do, as long as I do it to the best of my ability using my skills, which is the learning process, I will become successful because I would have done things in my image and I would get to a point where I feel successful. And that's kind of like reminiscent of integrating the idea of someone who identifies as a creator who only wants to make the things in their vision. So that's not appealing to logic. That is appealing to subjectivity. And then it would be a remarkable yes. Right? If you do not care about what other people think about, you can only be successful. That's how the human condition dictates that you are the only person to be able to determine if you're successful. You could, and it is possible to hate yourself. Absolutely. So we're not talking about it in that sense, but you could end up so the opposite of all this stuff, right? What is unsuccessful using the let's counter the other stuff. So on the one hand, if it's a no, then it would mean that if I chose another profession, then I wouldn't excel. I wouldn't become equally successful. And that's it. Like, that's objectively how you would compare it. You compare it cross-sectionally. I am, say, 70th percentile of psychology field, my theoretical self that chose psychology, and then I'm 90th percentile if I chose biology, right? These two things. So objectively, you could say, okay, and then let's throw one on top of that. Let's take the second perspective and talk about philosophy for a moment and psychology. In these universes, there's only one me. So even if I'm in the 70th percentile of psychology, I don't know, and I won't tell you that I would know that I would be in the 90th percentile in science, in biology. So no matter what, I can rationalize that I'm successful. This is in isolation. So when we're doing these thought experiments, it's not only necessary to balance objectivity, which is like you're comparing your hypothetical self, which I'm appealing to, right? Say I'm 70% here, 90% here. We're hypothetically comparing things that can't exist at the same time. And then when you think of subjectivity, since these people can only exist in isolation, they would be having the same exact conversation if you're doing the same learning process. Like, if that is held consistent, then I would naturally have come across all these things again. And what I would come to the conclusion is I would feel successful as a psychology major, biology major, or any of it, because it would be in isolation, and I would give you the same remarks about, since I don't know, I don't have a clone here, right? Literally in coexistence, whatever I end up doing, since I'm a learner, rarely is there a downside. The longer I live, the more positive I become about myself, generally speaking. Like, what is the one thing you have to do every single day? Well, you have to live. Well, what opportunities do you have when you're living? You can choose to learn. So if you're always learning every day, then you get up every day and you always feel like you won. What that value is, I spend a lot of time evaluating that. So I must also be able to appreciate feeling negative, right? So there are things that I can tell you that made it more difficult for me to do other things. That's a way to balance myself, because learning process also involves discomfort and things like oaths, pushing myself to an edge that's uncomfortable, then falling back to an edge that is comfortable, is something that I use so that my learning process doesn't fade. It doesn't like become stagnant. So a lot of times this would be a segue into where I talk about how people love challenges in their lives. And this is also kind of like what we just talked about in music, where I would probably ruffle some feathers here and there and they would like leave on the drop of a dime. That's fair. For sure. I always try to end with a complimentary statement, because I truly believe the most arrogant, egotistical people are the ones that can change the course of history. I'm just not one of them, right? So here, when it comes to the learning process, I need to do the same. I cannot rely on the idea that whatever I'm doing that's done well is the thing that will continue to pay out. So it's kind of a paradox. To describe what a person that loves learning is a person that is consistently trying to balance being in their element and out of their element. When you're in your element, you learn the least. When you're out of your element, you have the potential to learn the most. You have to balance the risks with how out of comfort you are. So this feeds into the digression of challenges. When I want a challenge, I let someone else determine what I have to talk about. So what is the most challenging thing for someone who wants to learn about people and learn about how to communicate with them, make mistakes, perhaps come off as some arrogant person who thinks they know more than another person who spends their entire life dedicated to the field? Right? I've made those mistakes, absolutely. Whether intentionally or not, they are part of the learning process. And all these discussions and whatnot, I place myself inherently knowing that. So what are the skills that complements that? I know how to apologize. I know that I make mistakes. And I actually will tell the people, I'm sorry that I made the mistake, or I push aggressively. It's part of my learning process. So I hope you understand that if I don't give it my all, I won't learn or change because of it. And that I welcome people to be aggressive but understanding. That is a challenge. So when you're thinking about musicians, right? I like to tie everything back neatly so that it reinforces everything. One last thing, right? One last thing is that if you like a challenge, the greatest challenge is the things you don't have control over, and then how you adapt to them, in my opinion. So if you're a musician... Oh, no, don't worry. This is the final one. If you choose to only make things for yourself, it can feel very lonely and challenging in itself. But if you choose not to care about things you can't control, then it's typically less challenging. You don't have to take up the challenge. So when someone is selfishly making music for themselves, that's a different type of challenge. I'm not suggesting it's any less or more challenging than caring about what other people like. Yeah. And you're welcome. Always. I'm always here to have a digression. Because, you know, videos abode. Good night, though. Thanks for hanging out again, Alex. I love the questions, by the way. You should lead a conversation sometime. I would love to know what's on your mind. Like things that you slept on or something. So you're always welcome. Alright. And sleep well. Thanks a lot. Alright. So, yeah, we already wrapped up that, so we're gonna... Guess I'm gonna break it up into 2 segments. Alright. We're gonna switch game. Thanks. I will try to have fun. And sleep well, and good luck with everything, Alex.